Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. In this one, I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, if you followed the round 1 game, you know that I got off to a bit of a disappointing start with a draw with a white against a much lower rated player, and I was hoping to bounce back in this one. Hopefully I got in the first round jitters out of my system, and I could get back on track. My opponent in this one was an individual by the name of Kolja Kuehn, another German player, this time much younger. I noticed he was born in '99, so 20 years old, or 19. Perhaps he hadn't turned 20 yet at the time of this game. And another challenge, especially when you're playing juniors, they tend to improve their game much more quickly than older players, and their ratings don't always necessarily catch up. So I definitely need to be on my P's and Q's in this one. So I was black and was hoping to do something a little bit, unique, or at least, improve on what I'd done in previous games. So let's get into it. So anyways, white played e4, and I brought out c6. I had gone for the French in some previous tournaments, but I also played some Caro-Kann and was thinking that a positional route would be more up my alley in this one. d4, d5. And now e takes d5 was played. And after e takes d5, you always know you're either going to get an exchange variation after a move like bishop d3 and c3, or you're going to get a pan-off Botvinnik attack with c4, which is typically more aggressive and aims to put extreme pressure on black center and try to generate some attacking chances on the king side. And it turned out that my opponent was in for the latter because he played c4 very quickly, and that told me he was in for the pan-off Botvinnik. Now, what happens in these systems is a lot of times white is willing to get an isolated pawn on d4 because ultimately, in many positions, I wind up capturing on c4 or white winds up capturing on d5. But the point is, with the isolated pawn, he's able to try and generate space on the king side and initiate some type of attacking chances there connected with a knight coming to e5, a bishop on d3, maybe a knight on c3, and just the pieces kind of pointing towards the king side. So I just want to point that out, that even in this pawn structure here, just a few moves in, it kind of informs where the pieces ought to go. So just keep those themes in mind. So anyways, I went knight f6, which is normal. I'd prefer to capture on d5 with the knight, so you reinforce that pawn. Nothing new here. Knight c3. And now e6. e6 is a bit of an older variation, or older line. Karpov tended to favor this e6 move a lot. The modern treatment of this system is actually knight c6. But, there's nothing wrong with doing things a little bit old school. The point is if you delay this e6 move, sometimes you can actually get the bishop outside of the chain. So one of the absolute main lines is actually knight f3 and bishop g4, and then there's this complicated line with c takes d5, knight takes d5, queen b3, and there's implications in this type of position that are fairly theoretical, and I just didn't want to go down a path where white potentially knew how to force the endgame that can arise here, because there is a complicated endgame that can arise where white has little to no chances of actually losing the game after bishop takes f3, and I believe g takes f3, and there's some lines here with queen takes b7. I'm trying to recall them right now, but I think it's something along the lines of like e6, queen takes b7, knight takes d4, bishop b5 check, knight takes b5, and now instead of taking on b5 right away, you go for queen c6 check because the queen on d8 cannot block because the a8 rook is hanging, so you have to go king e7, and then after queen takes b5, there's this queen d7, takes, and they're essentially the scenario where white can try and play this ending where he can play bishop f4, bishop e3, castle queenside, and argue that his outside passed pawn gives him chances in ending where even though his structure is ruined on the king side and I have this d pawn. So these positions are fairly, very close to equal, fairly drawn, and most of the games end in a draw. And I just didn't want to play a line that was this forcing right off the jump. So instead of testing his knowledge in this type of endgame, I thought it'd be a little bit smarter to play e6 when, the lines are a little less forcing. So anyways, white went for knight f3, and I went bishop e7. Again, trying to just castle and get a normal game. And here was actually the first surprise because white actually went for c takes d5. And this move in itself is not, so, I mean, it's been played hundreds of times before, but what his follow-up was actually, I think, really the key surprising thing, because after knight takes d5, he actually went for queen b3. And this is extremely unusual, and I would actually argue incorrect. The point is that the queen is a little bit misplaced here, and you're really not exerting a whole lot of pressure on d5 anyway. Even if you just look here, if white gets another move, knight takes d5 isn't really a threat. It's not like I'm losing material or anything. And in the meantime, you wasted precious time on playing queen b3 that you could have used to develop your bishop. So instead of queen b3, the normal move is actually bishop d3. And then, the game kind of proceeds along normal lines. Black might castle. Some lines he takes on c3. Other lines he might go back to f6 to just make sure this knight on f6 is tending to the king side. And just a normal game arises where, again, black has a better pawn structure, but white will have a short-term initiative on the king side based upon his bishops sort of darting in that direction and, keeping peace on the board. Typically, when you have a space advantage, and white does have a tiny space advantage here, you want to keep your minor pieces on the board because, the other side is a little bit cramped. And I'm slightly cramped while I try to finish my development with knight c6, b6, and bishop b7. So this would be a more normal course of action, and queen b3 kind of doesn't really do that. And so normally when something happens that is a little bit strange, you might say, oh, you need to punish it right away. But in actual fact, a lot of times it's actually a little bit easier to just, continue to play normally, and then eventually that weird or strange looking move will actually turn out to, hurt them later. So I just decided to castle and said, okay, you play this queen b3 move. I'm not trying to punish it in any way. I'm just continuing with my normal moves, and I'm going to argue that queen b3 doesn't make a lot of sense. So now white decided to kind of justify the queen on b3 and the pressure on the d5 knight by actually going knight takes d5, and I think that's another step in the wrong direction, even though I understand if you play queen b3, maybe you want to go for this. The issue here, just to say, well, what about like bishop c4? Well, the issue here is that after knight takes c3, whichever way you take, it's a little bit unpleasant, because if you play b takes c3 here, well, now I have knight c6, and I'm actually threatening knight a5 with tempo, hitting the bishop and the queen and securing the bishop pair. And you have to waste more time to move away. And in the interim, I can develop the rest of my pieces and potentially get pressure on your c3 pawn. So one sample line might go b6, castles, bishop b7, rook e1, rook c8, and I'm already priming up for knight a5 and, putting pressure on c4. So that's the issue with b takes c3. On the flip side, if you take on c3 with the queen, well, again, once the rook gets to c8, the queen and the bishop are going to be kind of a target. So I can even proceed here with knight c6, castles, maybe, well, I don't know if I want to go b6 here because the bishop takes e6, but maybe I would actually do this, because even here, if I lose a pawn, but I secure this monster bishop on d5, and the two bishops here should be, really, really strong, even though I'm a pawn down. But there's probably a scenario here where I don't have to give up a pawn, and I can try and get my rook to c8. So maybe I can play it a little bit slower with like bishop f6, putting more pressure on d4, and I don't know. I just have a strong feeling here that black is a lot better. Maybe there's even some strategy with playing a6 and then going for b5 like that. So in any case, my pawn structure is more convenient. This d pawn is pinned to the queen, and there are going to be a few moves that white needs to make just to kind of deal with some of the immediate problems in the position. So basically, the knight on d5 here is unscathed, and, putting more pressure on it doesn't actually do very much. And so I kind of understand why knight takes d5 was played, even though this whole plan in conjunction with queen b3 was not sensible. So anyway, after knight takes d5, I went queen takes d5 because I figured that, this foray with the queen meant that I had a little bit more time. Namely, my king is already castled, and I thought these queenless endgames would be favorable for me, so I wasn't reluctant to trade. The other thing is that if bishop c4 is played, kicking my queen away, I thought queen h5 would be a nice active square. And again, at some point in the future, knight c6 and knight a5 will be something that white needs to contend with. So queen takes d5 was played, and I went e takes d5. And here I think we can kind of stop and look at the position because, even though the material is equal, it's quite clear that black is better. And there are a few reasons for that. Firstly, my king is castled already. That's a big difference. So if you think that we each have one piece developed, and my king is castled, I'm a little bit ahead. Secondly, my pawn on d5 is a little bit more secure than the pawn on d4. And the reason for that is that once my knight comes to c6, I'm already eyeing the d4 pawn, whereas this knight on f3 is 2 diagonals away from the d5 pawn. And you might have heard me say this in previous videos, but when a knight is 2 diagonals away from a pawn, it takes at least 3 moves just to attack that pawn. So this d-pawn is fairly secure and doesn't require protection from any of my other pieces because you can't really target it for quite some time. Even the bishop on f1 would require 3 moves just to attack it, right? It would be like, let's say, bishop d3, bishop c2, bishop b3. And so my d5 pawn is very secure, where me coming knight c6 and bishop g4, this pawn on d4 is not. So that's a huge difference. And lastly, it looks to me like it might be easier to connect my rooks first, and we know how I feel about that. When the rooks are connected, usually the side that connects their rooks first is normally in really good position, and I felt that I was closer to doing that. So all these factors just meant black advantage. So anyways, white tried to play bishop g5 here, and I understand why he tried to do this, to try and trade some pieces and maybe get a little bit closer to an endgame. But the issue with this move is that, you're actually, the bishop is not particularly secure here, and I don't necessarily have to trade. Now, there was one line I had been looking at with bishop takes g5, but I thought that white actually had some good drawing chances, even though I managed to target the d4 pawn. After knight takes g5, knight c6, knight f3 back, and rook e8 check, king d2, and bishop g4, I actually thought that one interesting move here, believe it or not, that kind of tries to hold the game together is actually knight e5. And this is a pawn sacrifice because I'm winning this pawn, but, even with being a pawn down here, I thought white has pretty good drawing chances because this king is fairly active compared to my king on g8, and this d-pawn is a little bit isolated. And so I thought with the bishop being well placed on d3 and the rooks already being connected here, I thought that white might have some drawing chances, even being a pawn down. So I decided to keep material on the board and not try to simplify so quickly. And so after seeing that line, I actually went for the move f6. And the point is with f6 is that not only am I declining to trade these bishops, I'm also controlling the e5 square, which is really, really nice because it means the knight is even more restricted. And so I thought f6 was a really, really nice touch. And you might say, well, why are you pushing, a pawn in front of your king? Isn't that weakening? Well, the thing is this is an endgame now, and the queens are off the board, and the king is not getting checkmated. So at the end of the day, my king is going to want to enter the foray pretty quickly, and, now I give the king that opportunity sometime down the line. And in the meantime, again, I'm restricting white's minor pieces. So after f6, the most natural diagonal to stay on is f4, and that makes a lot of sense, keeping an eye on the long diagonal. But you can argue now that it would have been better for him to start with bishop f4 because, f6 was a move I probably was going to need to make to restrict the knight. And here I got it with a tempo because he went bishop g5 first. So after bishop f4, I have many options here, but I actually went bishop b4 check. And the idea with this was I actually wanted to push this bishop away from the diagonal it was on now. So I thought that it would be nice for my bishop to be on the d6, this b8 to h2 diagonal and stand on d6. And I didn't like the fact this bishop was there, so I thought that if I give this intermediate check and then the bishop blocks, which it did, that my bishop would now go back and secure the d6 square. So I thought that was a little bit of trickery that was clever. And I now threw in another move, rook e8 check, which I thought was smart, because now if bishop e2, he's also pinning himself, and he can't play bishop e3 because he's pinned here. So just a little bit of finesse to get my pieces active. And he actually wound up playing king d1 so he can remain, so he doesn't pin himself again with bishop e2. But now after bishop d6, I have this really nice scenario where my rook commandeers the e-file, my bishop got to the longest diagonal, and he's just a little bit passive. There were other ways to play the position. I will show one other way instead of bishop b4 check. One other way was to play knight c6. And the point is now that sometimes I have knight b4 as an idea, and, maybe getting at c2 and connecting stuff with bishop f5. But I didn't like a3 here, stopping my knight and my bishop from accessing that b4 square. But it turns out that these light squares now are a little bit sensitive because of a3, in particular the b3 square. And I actually could continue to play with bishop g4, bishop e2, rook e8, bishop e3 back, because now there's some lines where I might be actually targeting the d4 pawn. And after bishop e3, knight a5, you can actually see that even in this position, I don't have the counterplay on the e-file necessarily, but this a3 move weakened these light squares, and I'm ready to pounce on them with knight b3 or knight c4. And really, knight c4 is the juicy one because, it really requires him to give up the bishop pair, which would be a very, very unfortunate circumstance for white. So, again, just to show there are many ways to play this endgame where black has a slight advantage. So anyways, back to the game. Bishop e4, bishop d2, rook e8, bishop d6. And now white went for another move that really was puzzling to me and kind of demonstrated that he wasn't aware of the dangers in the position, because he played one of the moves I think is maybe the worst possible move you can make, which is strangely g3. And I don't get this move. I mean, if I had to kind of posit a guess, maybe it's that he thought he wants to target the d5 pawn in the future, and that putting the bishop on g2 enables him to do that and pressure down a long diagonal. The important thing, though, to note in this position is just not ready for this, and is creating more weaknesses, namely these light squares, than he can bargain for with trying to get that bishop to that diagonal. And so it was really, really puzzling to me because I didn't think there was time for this. And I pounced pretty quickly with first knight c6, keeping an eye on d4. And then after bishop g2, I went for bishop f5. And you could see here that, white's pretty much in a world of trouble because the rooks are still split, right? My bishop is controlling c2. My rooks are firmly connected. And, this knight seems to be tied down to the d4 pawn. This bishop is more passive than my bishop. And you can basically compare every minor piece and heavy piece in my position and compare it to the white pieces and say that black stands considerably better. So even though the material is equal here, black is just dominating. So white now went bishop c3, I think, to provide reinforcement for the pawn on d4. But you can see here that, this bishop now stands almost like a fat pawn. It's really limited in scope, right? It's not really doing much than being purely defensive. And I'm really first to, take space in the center and keep going. Now, there are many ways to play here, but, you want to be pretty precise because the d5 pawn is sensitive. So I decided to play bishop e4. And I thought this was pretty smart because now I'm kind of prophylactically responding to any sort of knight moves that attack the d5 pawn. And my bishop on e4 just kind of cuts the position in two. And it's okay that I maybe trade a few pairs of minor pieces given how bad this bishop is on c3. The point is my advantages lie very deep into the endgame because my pawn is on a light square in the center and his pawn is on a dark square. And his pawn is going to be a real constant target, whereas mine won't. And I still have a lot of activity. So the color complexes work out in my favor. White now went king d2, connecting the rooks. And I guess maybe that's another point behind bishop c3. But the issue with this move is that, there are other issues basically connected to the point that his pieces lack a lot of coordination here. So instead of me kind of telling you what the move I played is, why don't you think on it, black to move here and, go for a massive advantage. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video. The move I played here was b5. And the reason this all of a sudden becomes a strong move is because now that the king's on d2, he's cut off the oxygen for his bishop on c3, and b4 just threatens to win a piece. So he's still in a real problematic position. And if you play a move like a3, I can keep the fire going with a5 and again renew the threat of b4. So the real point is that even though his rooks are connected, now he has new problems and just all his pieces are just tied up. Now to save his bishop on c3, he decided to play b3, but this actually creates more weaknesses. Namely, now the c3 square and the a3 square are sensitive, and it appears that the king is tied to the bishop on c3 because it's fairly unprotected. So in this position, I decide to now take advantage of that weakness that was played and went in for bishop a3. And this move I like a lot because not only do I stop a rook from getting to the all-important c-file, that it was actually weakened on my part by playing b5. Now my knight on c6 is a little less secure than it was a move ago. But the point is now I'm renewing the threat of b4 because now the bishop does not have the b2 square to go back to. So again, you can see every move I'm getting with tempo, and I recognize here that the position must be totally winning because it's hard to parry all of the issues that white has. White now went rook ae1 to at least, give himself one square, the a1 square for the bishop. And I must say it was really tempting to consider playing b4 just because after rook a1, after bishop a1, this bishop is a totally dead piece. But on the flip side, my bishop on a3 is not, as active as I might want it to be. I mean, it is eyeing c1, but I prefer not to cut off the oxygen from my bishop while, putting his in prison. So I decided to, opt against this, even though aesthetically it does look nice that this bishop is just totally done on the a1 square. So instead, I decided to play a little bit more responsibly, and I went for knight b4. And the point is here, I was eyeing the a2 pawn and clearing the c-file for my rook to potentially wreak havoc there. There were some positions where I was even looking at rook takes c3 as an exchange sacrifice. So let's say if white continues to do nothing and goes like h3, rook c8, h4, even this became an option I was thinking about. I mean, I might not have done it, but you can see here as white it's extremely limited and seems to be on the run, although maybe he escapes in the end to f4. So something I was thinking, quite seriously about. And, it does seem like the king is on the run. I mean, if I go here, I don't know, it just looked kind of crazy. I mean, it looks to be almost mate, honestly. Let's say, yeah, this looks pretty bad, doesn't it? So, just something I was thinking about. But anyways, white didn't do completely nothing and now decided to finally play knight h4, which I think should have been played a few moves back, at least trying to get rid of my dominating bishop and relieve some of the pinning action. And I have a decision to make because if I take on g2, all of a sudden this knight on h4 can get activated and redeployed via e3 or f4 and then target my d5 pawn, so I didn't want to do that. On the flip side, if he takes on e4, the pawn structure changes a little bit because I wind up having my pawn on e4, and I kind of have to weigh the consequences of that, whether the pawn is a target or a strength or so on. And I just kind of reasoned that it was more strength because if d takes e4, now the d file would be opened in my favor. So I felt that I shouldn't actually, capture and I should keep the tension. And this is actually a theme that happens a lot where you keeping the tension is actually the right thing to do. The other thing I was thinking about is if he plays f3, where does my bishop go? Because I didn't want to go back to f5, well, because it's hanging, and I didn't want to go back to g6 because then white can take it and secure the bishop pair. And, even in a position where I do have this massive lead in development and activity, I still want to, keep the fundamentals sound and not give up the two bishops if I have to. So, I don't know. If f3, I would have had to, think for a little bit and decide what to do. But, fortunately, a2 is hanging and I had some other things in the work. So, I actually decided to play knight takes a2 and just, at least say that, well, I have knight takes c3 as an option. If f3 now, after knight takes c3, if you take again on a4, now I can take with check, and now I'm 2 pawns up. And if you take on c3, I have rook a c8 check, and this king after king d2 is just going to get destroyed. I mean, immediately bishop b4 check wins an exchange, so this one would also be done. So actually no time for f3 after knight takes a2. It turns out, though, that knight takes a2 wasn't the best move, and even stronger would have been rook a c8. And the point is that I keep my coordination and I keep the initiative going. Again, now a simple line would be bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and I still have this knight takes a2 threat, but now I also have knight d5 as an idea, putting more pressure on c3. And basically, if this bishop has to move and I start to invade, the game is just over extremely quickly. And the nice thing about, again, d takes e4 is my knight actually has the d5 square. So play could continue knight f5, trying to fork me here, but then I have knight d5, and I think this position is just as harmonious as it gets, because my knight is blockading this pawn firmly, c3 is hanging, my bishop is covering this fork, and just everything is working. Just to show you a few more moves in this line, let's say bishop a5 to preserve the bishop. Now I can actually play rook c6, and I'm threatening to trap it on a5 with rook a6. And you can have something like knight e3, takes, and now b4, and the bishop is completely trapped. After like rook e1, rook f5, just to preserve the pawn, f3, rook e8, and now there's even mating threats on the c file. And the reason I play rook c8 too is now rook a8 is finally a threat. So if rook e2 to just stop the mating threats, now rook a6, and you can see now that the rook is on c8, he can't actually go to bishop c7 and get out of there. So just a dominating position for black if I keep the tension. And, that's always the thing you have to wrestle with in your games is, sometimes you can release the tension and win a pawn, or you can keep the tension and get an even bigger return. And I just was a little bit impatient here about securing that pawn when I could have gotten a bigger return. Anyways, knight takes a2 doesn't spoil anything tragically. I'm a pawn up in a better position. But after f3, the game, f3 wasn't played. But anyways, if he plays a little bit precisely, the game can continue, and he can live to fight more. He wound up playing bishop a5, and now I played bishop b4 check, which is actually another mistake. And another example of about keeping tension being more important than trading pieces and cashing in when you're up. I was afraid that my knight and my bishop here would be a problem after rook a1. But the point is that as long as the king is on d2, I have bishop b4 check whenever I want. And then I just trade the pieces then. So instead of rushing with bishop b4, I can again improve with rook a c8 and get counterplay going here and force rook a1 to be played. And in this version, this is a much better version for me, because now I'm threatening rook c2, and I force the rook to a passive square on the a file, and he has to cover c2 himself. So after rook hc1, now I can go a6, and I just managed to consolidate here. After knight f5 trying to threaten knight d6, I actually just have the nice move king f8. And the point is that after knight d6, I could just trade on c1 and go rook d8 next. And I'm just up an extra pawn on the queen side, and this d4 pawn is a little bit weak. So point is, keep the tension when you can. Unless you have major returns, a lot of times it's better to keep the tension until you're absolutely ready to resolve it, because, the pressure and the buildup is usually a very good thing. So anyways, I went for bishop b4, takes, and now white went f3, pushing my bishop back, asking me a question about my bishop. Note, I don't want to go to f5 because of the knight, or g6 because of the knight, so I went bishop d3, which was the other nice point of having the knight on b4, is now the knight's protecting the d3 bishop. And a move like king c3 doesn't solve anything because I have a5 protecting the knight. So my minor pieces managed to hold on to each other quite well. So instead of king c3, white actually went for f4. And this is actually the decisive mistake. Their only move to really stay in the game would have been bishop h3 to try and, get counterplay on e6 and f5 and try to trade, this wayward knight on h4 that isn't really doing anything. But I think this is kind of a hard move to see, especially because, it's just a little bit unnatural to kind of move another piece towards the side to kind of redeploy it towards the center. And I'm not so surprised that he missed that one. But it was the move to make. Now, instead, after f4, white is completely winning, and I'll give you a moment to try and find out why that is. Black to play and win. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what to do. The move that wins in this position and the move I played is g5. And the point is that this knight can't step forward, and after a subsequent exchange on g5, or if he leaves it there, my bishop comes back to e4 where it rightfully belongs and pins the knight to the bishop on g2, and it plugs the file so he doesn't have counterplay on the e file. And then another really important thing is if you play bishop takes d5, which you think, the knight is tied to my bishop on d3 and can't take on d5. Well, I actually can, because after knight takes d5, king takes d3, the knight is still hanging on h4. So you don't have time to play bishop takes d5 check, which you would love to play if this knight wasn't, a problem. So because of that, the knight has to return, but he first started with f takes g5, and I played f takes g5. And now after knight f3 back, I went bishop e4. And again, this issue is this pin is really, really problematic. And now that, my g5 pawn is here, he can't even release it right away because knight h4 just hangs the piece. So it's just very, very annoying that you can't get out of this pin efficiently. And in the meantime, I can play on the c file, which is where my advantage exists on the queen side. Note that another move to try and break up the pin like h4 doesn't work either because I have g4. And again, there's no square this knight can go to where the bishop is saved. So this position is totally winning, and there's just not much going here. And I think white kind of understood that and decided to play, a little bit desperately, kind of go for a desperado. And he went for rook takes e4, an exchange sacrifice, which should really hardly work in this position because I was already a pawn up. So, okay, after d takes e4, rook takes e4, knight takes g5, now the material is equal, but I'm just up in exchange, and that should be enough to win. So it's really just a matter of technique here to find the most efficient way. So you might say initially, well, isn't the e-pawn attack? Don't you want to do something about that? And I did, but the issue is that if I play a move like e3 check, I was wary about a move like king c3. And now the point is my rook on a8 is harassed, and my knight on b4 is attacked. So that wouldn't be the outcome I was looking for. So instead, I decided, you know what? I'm going to leave that pawn on e4 and try to get some more activity to try and make something happen. And I thought the best way to do that was to play rook a c8 now. And it's funny because rook a c8 was a move, we'd been talking about several times in other variations where it was important to get this counterplay here. And I thought it was important here that I step out of the line of fire on the diagonal and try to get active with my extra exchange instead of defending, a pawn. I thought it's more important for my pieces to be prominent than just try to tie down to that pawn. And the issue here is that there's no really effective way to take on e4. If you take with the knight on e4, well, you fall prey to rook c2 check and the bishop on g2 is picked off. And if you take on e4 with the bishop, which my opponent did, it's actually a blunder. And the reason for that is that after bishop takes e4 was played, you see this knight is the one that's defending the bishop on e4. So now I actually have the very simple h6. And the point is that the knight is now attacked, and the bishop will be hanging if the knight moves. So the position is just, collapsing. White did try, the only move, I think, to try and fight just a moment longer, which is knight h7. And there's a nifty trick there that if I take on e4, there's knight f6, check fork. But the issue is now this knight is so far into my camp that it's nearly trapped. And my response, king g7, is not very complicated. Basically, now I rob the knight of the f6 square, and I still retain a threat against the e4 bishop. White now played bishop b1, just moving it as far away as possible from my pieces. And now I decide to play rook e d8, just, attacking d4 and just kind of trying to open up the lines for my rooks. White went rook e1. I think, eyeing this, rook e7 check as a potential highway to get some counterplay. If, I'm, careless and go a6, for instance, this could be a problem because rook e7 check, my only move is, well, no, I also have king g8. But let's say I went king h8. Now after knight f6, who's mating who? Because rook h7 is a major mate threat, and it's very, very unstoppable. There's no way I can interpose on the 7th rank right now. So I did have to remain a little bit alert, but I wasn't going to allow that type of activity anyway, and I went for rook takes d4 check. Point being that now the king can't go to the c file, he has to go to the e file and interrupt the rook on that file. So king e3 is played attacking my rook, and now being up material, I'm totally happy to trade, and I went for rook e8 check. And after king takes d4, rook takes e1, I'm still up in exchange. This knight is still trapped, and now the bishop is attacked, so I'm going to just win a whole piece. White went bishop f5, kind of, I know, another just in vain. Maybe he just didn't want to resign just yet. That happens with younger players, I notice. So it is what it is. And now I just went knight c6 check, attacking this king and eventually trying to get knight e7 in, which would attack the bishop and, close the door shut on the game. Because if the king moves somewhere, let's say king d3, now I have knight e7 and then knight g6, and I cut off the oxygen from the bishop protecting the knight, and then that's game over. So anyways, after knight c6, my opponent resigned. Very interesting game, I think, pretty instructive as far as the queen's the queenless middle game is concerned. Once the queens came off the board, I think it really kind of was a clinic in the difference between active pieces, weak squares, connecting rooks, and all those themes I talk about kind of ad nauseum on this channel. So I hope you enjoyed that technique. But I think one thing that I did mess up on quite a bit through the game was the concept of keeping tension when there were latent opportunities in the position if I waited to cash in. I think I was too quick to cash in and win a pawn when I could have won more material if I was a little bit more patient. And me delaying rook a c8 was definitely a sign of that. So definitely keep that in mind in your own games. Keeping tension is really, really a critical component in chess. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.